In recent years, many anti-trans folks have latched onto the inclusion of trans women in women's sports as a means to advance the overall anti-trans cause. This is seen as an easy win by many anti-trans folks, since to many folks uneducated on the topic, this seems blatantly unfair or even misogynistic on the surface. It enables anti-trans folks to push this idea that biological men are invading women's spaces while pretending there's no greater nuance. Overall, the idea that trans women don't belong in women's sports is built upon three main premises. These are: premise 1, trans women are biologically male or biologically men. Premise 2, it's unfair for non-trans cisgender women to have to compete with biological men in sports. And lastly, premise 3, competitive sports should be as fair as possible. However, every single one of these premises quickly falls apart upon further examination, and that's exactly what we're going to do here. Premise 1, trans women are biologically male or biologically men. Firstly, trans women are not biologically male. If you've already seen my video on biological sex, you can skip this section entirely. I'll try to include a timestamp somewhere on the screen, and if not, I'd highly recommend you go watch that video after this one, of course. Biological sex is a social construct which society has upheld and created in a similar manner to the gender binary. But Isabella, our sex characteristics and reproductive anatomy definitely physically exist, so how is biological sex a social construct? A social construct is not merely something that is tangible. Rather, it is something that exists not in objective reality, but instead because living beings agree that it exists. Social constructs are talked about, social, and built up. Construct. This means that any system of classification invented by living beings, from race to gender to biological sex, is a social construct. Essentially, I am not here to tell you that our bodies are social constructs, rather that it is the way we have decided to label and categorize our bodies that is a social construct. With that said, biological sex, like gender, is far from binary. It's much more complex than those born with higher testosterone, a penis, XY chromosomes, etc. are biologically male, and those born with a vagina, XX chromosomes, and higher estrogen are biologically female. Most folks don't even know for sure if they have a specific set of chromosomes or if they have a typical level of a specific hormone for the sex they were assigned at birth. Most folks simply haven't been tested for such. This brings us to intersex folks. Folks who are born with reproductive anatomy or sex characteristics that deviate from the societally accepted male-female norm. For example, somebody could be born with XY chromosomes, a vagina, high testosterone, and a uterus. Some folks will try to outright dismiss the existence of intersex folks through proclaiming that intersex variations are so rare that they shouldn't even count towards these discussions. However, even using more conservative definitions, at least 2% of the global population is intersex. That's the same number of red-haired and green-eyed folks in the world. But we generally don't go around saying that green-eyed folks don't count in conversations about eye color, or that red-haired folks don't count in conversations about hair color. So why then ignore intersex folks in conversations about biological sex? Doing so simply serves to do harm onto intersex folks. As seen in society's attempts to push intersex folks into the biological sex binary through purely cosmetic, non-consensual, oftentimes physiologically and psychologically damaging procedures conducted on intersex infants to normalize their genitalia. This is referred to as intersex genital mutilation, IGM for short. And no, for all those anti-trans folks watching, this is not the same as trans folks consensually receiving procedures that have proved repeatedly, study after study, to better our mental well-being. Even the way we distinguish between biological sex and gender isn't very sound. If we agree that our current understanding of biological sex is far too oversimplified, arbitrary, and faulty, in a similar manner to how a binary view of gender is, what makes us any less capable of self-identifying our biological sex in a similar manner to which we self-identify our gender identity? The only terms necessary to differentiate trans and cis folks is just that: trans and cis. Who's to say that the difference between transgender and cisgender folks is one of biological sex if biological sex isn't defined in such a clear-cut way to begin with? Therefore, if a trans woman wants to self-identify their biological sex as woman, then that's what their biological sex is. If a trans man wants to self-identify their biological sex as man, then that's what their biological sex is. If someone who is non-binary wants to self-identify their biological sex as non-binary, then that's what their biological sex is too. And now this leads us to premise 2. It's unfair unfair for non-trans cisgender women to have to compete with biological men in sports. So we've already debunked the part about trans women being biological men, but we are still yet to answer the question, is it unfair that cisgender women have to compete against trans women in sports? A multitude of studies have found that after just 12 months of testosterone suppression, the overwhelming majority of transgender women retain no competitive advantage over the overwhelming majority of cisgender women. And competitive difference between trans women who have undergone less than 12 months of testosterone suppression and cisgender women are yet to be studied in depth. Therefore, it is likely that a lot of these differences that folks like to study disappear even sooner than 12 months of testosterone suppression. Additionally, just as cisgender women may be disadvantaged to non-medically transitioning trans women, medically transitioning trans women are disadvantaged to cisgender women in a variety of ways. These disadvantages can include the diuretic effects of testosterone suppressive medications, reduced speed, endurance, and recovery as a result of reduced muscle mass and aerobic capacity while maintaining an on average larger body than cisgender women, and sociological stressors and disadvantages that also impact non-medically transitioning trans women. Furthermore, cisgender women aren't even as disadvantaged to cisgender men as once thought. The longer time goes on, the closer women's sports records come to that of men's sports records. A prime example of this is the progression of the women's versus men's marathon record, as seen here on screen. This is largely due to the fact that men have had a head start in competitive sports. When competitive sports came into greater popularity in the 19th century, it was mostly rich, abled white men that had the social support, time, and money to participate. This has left women with less time to reach the same point in sports science as men, alongside an overarching misogynistic societal disinterest and disregard for women's sports, resulting in less women's coaches, players, funding, pay, and all-around resources. While many claim this is due to a skill level difference between men and women's sports, making men's sports more interesting, this is simply not the case. Men's college level March Madness is the second largest sports event in the United States of America each year, despite the college league being perceived as much lower skill than the NBA. So clearly it has nothing to do with skill level or perceived skill level. And now, time for premise 3. Competitive sports should be as fair as possible. This idea that competitive sports should be as fair as possible has long existed and is extended beyond even just bans on trans folks in sports. Prior to these sports bans' primary target being trans women, their primary target was intersex women. Despite most intersex women being cisgender and never having transitioned, we've seen bans on intersex women's participation in women's sports as far back as the 1930s, and I'm sure even much further back. This is when the Olympics first introduced their highly invasive biological sex verification in women's categories, fearing that intersex women may hold an unfair biological competitive advantage over perisex, aka non-intersex, women. Up until the 1960s, this testing was conducted through the physical examination of women's bodies, which has since been switched to the still invasive chromosomal and hormonal testing. To this day, cisgender intersex women continue to face bans in the name of keeping sports fair. What may be the most prominent case of this today is when Caster Semenya was barred from running in the Olympics in 2019. Semenya was banned from running in the Olympics after being forced to undergo highly invasive testing that concluded that she had testosterone levels that matched that of the average cisgender perisex man, despite being a cisgender woman. This resulted in Semenya being forced to take testosterone suppressive medication to compete. This medication caused her nausea, panic attacks, insomnia, burning sensations in her stomach, and a variety of other symptoms that most folks definitely don't want to live with on a day-to-day basis. She later stopped this medication due to these horrific side effects and was no longer allowed to ever compete in the Olympics for running. This story is not dissimilar of that from other intersex women athletes who have undergone similar horrors. Not to mention that the overwhelming majority of athletes accused of being trans or intersex are athletes of color. This results in more athletes of color being tested to see if they're secretly trans or if they're intersex, and therefore more intersex athletes of color being barred from participating than white intersex athletes. For example, of the 13 athletes identified as being intersex at the Olympics over the years, only 3 have been white. Furthermore, those white intersex athletes were only identified at a time in which much fewer athletes of color participated in the Olympics. Not a single white intersex athlete has been identified since 1968. And this is despite the fact that while there may be more athletes of color in the Olympics today, it is still disproportionately white. Overwhelmingly so. And the truth of the matter is, sports aren't really meant to be fair. And to make them as fair as possible, whatever that may mean, would require the exclusion of hundreds of millions or even billions of folks from participating. And at present, the only areas in which we even attempt fairness in competitive sports is biological sex and drug use. If we are to truly strive for fairness in sports, then why not segregate sports by economic class too? After all, those who are richer and have greater amounts of time, money, and resources are statistically those most successful in sports, overwhelmingly so. While economic class might not be as innate, it is still something that exists under our current capitalist system. And if we are to account for what we categorize as biological sex differences, why then don't we account for these sorts of differences too, as to not disadvantage low-income folks? Not to mention that there's plenty of cisgender perisex women with advantages pertaining to their biological structures and functions. This includes biological advantages pertaining to their height, lactic acid production, lung capacity, double jointedness, and more. If you look towards those who are generally most successful in a sport, they generally share certain advantageous traits. The average Women's National Basketball Association player in the United States of America, for example, is 6 feet and 1 inch in height, nearly an entire foot taller than the average height of a woman living in the United States of America of 5 feet and 3.5 inches. And if we are to exclude trans women and intersex women for biological advantages that often don't even exist over cisgender and perisex women, should we then also exclude these extraordinarily tall women to level the playing field for average height women and short women in basketball? Let's take a moment to look towards the most awarded Olympian of all time, Olympic swimmer Michael Phelps. Phelps has a variety of biological functions and structures that grant him advantages over his competitors. These advantages include an extraordinarily unique height to arm span ratio, enabling him to have more reach with each swim stroke. He has a 6'7" arm span to a 6'4" height, while most folks have a 1-to-1 height to arm span ratio. 12-liter lung capacity compared to 6 liters for the average man. Large palms and feet, allowing more water to be pushed with each stroke and kick, leading to greater propulsion and speed. Reduced lactic acid production, resulting in less muscle fatigue and muscle pain from swimming and exercise in general. To be exact, he has about half the lactic acid production of the average body. Double jointedness, enabling a greater range of motion. Short legs and a long torso, enabling less resistance in the water. A height of 6 feet and 4 inches, as mentioned previously, which is 9 inches taller than what the average height is for a man globally, which is 5 feet and 7 inches. Unlike trans women and intersex women, however, Michael Phelps, extraordinarily tall basketball players, and others mostly have their biological advantages celebrated in the context of their sports. In practice, though, there is really no difference between the unfair biological advantages of Michael Phelps, the unfair biological advantages of extraordinarily tall basketball players, and the perceived but most often untrue unfair biological advantages of trans women and intersex women. Just because the latter pertain to what we have decided to categorize as biological sex, and the others pertain to what we don't categorize as such, doesn't change anything about their comparatively unfair or perceived unfair impacts on real-world sports play. What is actually unfair is the arbitrary decision to include certain folks with biological advantages or perceived biological advantages, which are similarly, if not more impactful on real-world sports play, such as Michael Phelps and extraordinarily tall basketball players, yet exclude folks on the basis of biological sex advantages that often aren't even true, such as trans women and intersex women. This is especially contradictory when height, lung capacity, etc. are some of the very differences that trans and intersex women are often attacked for. If we are to truly invigorate women's sports, or in the words of anti-trans folks, save women's sports, we must increase funding, increase pay, increase all-around resources, and combat the real misogyny behind women's sports' current struggles. No amount of exclusion will counteract these issues, and if anything, they'll exacerbate them through pushing trans folks, intersex folks, trans allies, and intersex allies away. However, with all that I've explained throughout this video, I believe the only sensible conclusion is that gendered sports categories be abolished entirely. It makes no more sense to segregate sports by gender for fairness, quote unquote, than it does to segregate them by economic class, biological sex, or some other similar characteristics for quote unquote fairness. If gendered sports categories ultimately cease to exist, as I would hope for, our support for women's sports should merely be shifted towards support for women in non-gendered sports. On top of everything that I've already mentioned, this could also include affirmative action programs for women in non-gendered sports. Moreover, so long as gendered sports continue to exist, it will enable the exclusion of certain types of women from womanhood and overall be used as a means to define what a woman quote-unquote is and what a woman quote-unquote isn't. Thank you all for watching. Follow me on Twitter at IsabellaScar2. Follow me on Instagram at IsabellaScarlet_. Follow me on Blue Sky at IsabellaScarlet. And follow me on Tumblr at IsabellaScarlet1. Bye!